God, we come this morning listening for your still speaking voice. Speak afresh into our lives. We need it, God. We long for it. And so we ask that the words of my mouth and all of our mouths and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing to you. And where we depart from your Spirit, O God, may that quickly fall away. Amen. I wonder what you have spent your life wrestling with. Now, some of us have been privileged, lucky, blessed, whatever you like to call it. Things have more or less gone our way. The systems have been set up for our success. And while we may have had to work hard at things, the doors have opened relatively easily. For those for whom this is true, sometimes we don't question that ease enough, right? Recently, Princeton Theological Seminary, the institution from which I received my Master's of Divinity and the second oldest seminary and university in the country, released its report on the institution's history with slavery. And while there were some exceptional examples of students or alumni, professors or administrators who worked tirelessly, even gave their lives to end slavery, the report was fairly scathing of them as an institution. It was a reality of history that is difficult to look at or to acknowledge. I remember moving into the dorms there my freshman year of seminary. The dorms that were assigned to freshmen were these very tiny, narrow rooms. You could reach a hand out on either side and touch the walls on either side of you. We called them bowling alley rooms. Now, the upper classroom and the rooms next to these rooms had these enormous rooms. And none of us could understand why they would have built the rooms with such different sizes like that, until someone told us that those bowling alley rooms used to be the slave quarters, and the giant rooms next to them were their master's rooms. Part of the reason I chose Princeton was because they offered me an incredible scholarship that covered my tuition and my room. And even students who didn't receive that scholarship had most of their tuition paid for by a very large endowment that had grown and grown to be almost $1 billion. Now, that report on slavery that they just released revealed that 15 to 40% of the wealth that made up that endowment was generated by slave labor, by stolen, unjust, extorted labor. I didn't know it at the time, but I realize now that part of the financial ease of seminary for me was because something was stolen from someone else and handed to me. Now, that's not to say seminary was easy or that it didn't take a financial toll on me or that I didn't work hard to earn my degree or my scholarship. But I realize now that the system was set up for my success. So yes, there are some of us who have moved through some aspects of life with relative ease, and we may not realize it or even know why. But even so, many of us, even those of us that the world might deem privileged, have wrestled with something. Wrestled fiercely, struggled fiercely with something in our lives. I wonder what you have spent your life wrestling with. If you've ever watched someone wrestle or you've wrestled yourself, then you know it's this constant pushing, this constant holding at bay, trying not to be pinned down by something or someone. It's this constant effort to shove something or someone off, a pitting of your energy and force and your constant effort against the forces coming against you. To trying to reverse that force or redirect it or use it against itself or subdue it. I wonder what you are wrestling with. I know women who have experienced sexual trauma, who wrestle and wrestle to fight back shame, fear, mental illness, all as a result of their trauma. Every day is a struggle to reclaim themselves, their worth, their health, their survivorhood. I know veterans who come home changed by war, who wrestle daily to live with what they have experienced. They struggle to reintegrate, fighting for life every day. And as we know from the statistics, that wrestling once they return home claims more lives than the battlefield does. I know women who have worked and worked to be an expert in their field, but wrestle every day on the job to be heard in rooms of men who just talk over them, accept credit for their ideas, or get promoted over them. Did you know that the demographic in the U.S. right now, who is the most educated, has the most higher education degrees, is African American women? Yet that's not our stereotype, usually, of these intelligent, true experts in their field. Their level of education is not reflected in the pay scale and hardly represented at all in who's in management. All these women will tell you they've had to work 3 times as hard or more just to get to the level that others take for granted, to lay claim to respect, to dignity, and to a solid income that can feed them and their family. I sat next to at a Florida UCC conference last week an African-American colleague of mine who has her doctorate of ministry and is still struggling for respect in a conference that is very progressive and liberal. I wonder what you are wrestling with right now. I know farm workers who wrestle and wrestle with giants, people or organizations who possess power and control over the supply chain they harvest, and therefore over the working conditions in the fields, the wages they receive, and sometimes their housing or their immigration status. Year after year, they stand up, they demand justice, and they take a beating as these giants try to deflect responsibility, deny their power, and attack these farm workers' character. I know people who wrestle with an overwhelming feeling of white guilt, who try to push back against the paralysis that it brings over them. I know anti-racists and anti-sexists who wrestle inside themselves with their own racism and sexism daily, working relentlessly to change their thoughts, their words, their actions. I wonder what you are wrestling with. I know families and neighborhoods and individuals that wrestle against addictions and struggle so hard to recover from the ways that drugs and the mass incarceration rather than treatment of addicts have wreaked havoc on their communities. You know, those who claim their sobriety day after day after day, they're heroes. I know people who are transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so many other identities and orientations who wrestle to fight back homophobia and bigotry, and mostly, sadly, the narrative Christians have so artfully woven that they have now internalized, that they are sinful or abominations, that it would be better if they were dead than if they lived and loved as themselves. Every day they wrestle to claim pride in who they are, to claim God's love and God's blessing, to fight back the shame and the judgment. Every day they claim their worth, their love, their right to exist, to be employed, to be treated by a doctor or served by a baker. I know immigrants and refugees who wrestle so hard for life, for safety, for a better life for their children. They dare to claim their basic human rights, sometimes dare to defy unjust laws. And they open eyes to the fact that no human is illegal and everyone deserves the chance at life and liberty. I wonder what you are wrestling with. people of all different faiths who wrestle mightily to put into practice what they believe and to cling to hope even when they feel hopeless. Sometimes we underestimate how much active, intentional work it takes to actually live your values, to actually embody love and hope and faith. I know people in abusive or codependent relationships who don't even realize how much they've been wrestling and fighting, how much weight they are carrying until that relationship ends and they feel the lightness and the freedom. I wonder what you are wrestling with. I know people who've been diagnosed with potentially fatal illnesses and disease who fight their way through chemo and radiation and rehab or whatever the treatment might be, striving with bravery and persistence to lay claim to their health. I know people who've lost loved ones, who wrestle each day to get out of bed, put one foot in front of the other, and keep living with all that grief. I know people trapped in poverty who wrestle so hard to fight their way out. Do you know it takes almost 20 years of having nothing major happen for someone to actually get out of poverty? There are brave people who try day after day after day to claim their financial health, to ask for help, to work and work and work some more to get out of that poverty. I wonder what you are wrestling with. I could go on and on with this list of people in our midst and in our community who wrestle, who feel like they're fighting their way through life. Maybe I've hit on the things that you wrestle with, or maybe I haven't, but I imagine you know what it is you wrestle. I don't know why so many of us have to wrestle so fiercely in life. And there is probably not one of us in this room who hasn't asked God at some point, why do I have to wrestle my blessings from you, from the world, from this life? Why do I have to wrestle for justice, for love, for respect, for dignity, for equality, for pride in who I am and who you made me to be? For health, for safety, for security, these basic things. Why is life such a bloody struggle? Maybe that's why so many of us can relate so well to Jacob, the great wrestler of the Hebrew Scriptures. So often we like to talk about Jacob as this bad boy, this clever swindler who steals his brother's blessing from their father. But really, why do we tell the story that way? Why do we just accept that the blessing from their father belongs to his older brother Esau? Why are we always so quick to assume that what is legal, what is the established system is right or fair or just or what God wanted or intended? Instead of telling the story of a bad boy, why don't we tell the story of a brave young man who had an unjust and unfair system set against him from the start, and who wrestled and wrestled and persisted as he fought that injustice, who wrestled to lay claim to his worth and his worthiness, who refused to be denied or treated like he didn't matter, and who ultimately prevailed. But isn't that so like us? To call him criminal instead of heroic? All that determined that their father's blessing and inheritance belonged to Esau, the older brother, and not to Jacob, was mere seconds in birth order. Jacob and Esau were born so close together that Jacob was literally holding on to Esau's heel when they came out of the womb. Yet the law, the custom, the established order said that the father's blessing and inheritance belonged to to the older son. Now don't get me wrong. It wasn't that Esau was unworthy of his blessing. He was a good son. In fact, he was his father's favorite son. Hyper-masculine, big, strong, hairy, all those things the world favors. But his father never questioned the status quo, or whether it was really God's desire that such an unequal system of inheritance be perpetuated. In fact, Esau's masculinity compared to Jacob's relative femininity probably only reinforced for Isaac the idea that Esau deserved the blessing and the inheritance. But nothing about this inequality seemed fair to their mother, Rebekah, or to Jacob himself. Jacob came out of the womb wrestling with his brother for a fair shake, and he would continue throughout his life until he finally laid claim to that blessing Esau had always taken for granted. And of course, we know how the story goes, right? Jacob gains his father's blessing, and then he has to run for his life. Why? Well, we all know why. Esau was mad. As Father Arnel Aquino observes, many prophets end up bloody and dead because they afflict the comfortable, and then the comfortable turn murderous. But after giving it some time, giving Esau some space to cool down, Jacob returns to his brother to actually lay claim to that blessing that he received from his father, and he's prepared for a fight. Yet the night before he is to face his brother, he ends up wrestling with God. How true that is of so many of our experiences. How often do we think that it is really God we are up against, when in actuality we are fighting against something else? You know, we think that God or God's messenger just shows up there on the riverbank and attacks Jacob, starts wrestling him. But I wonder if it was the other way around. There's this interesting moment in the middle of this wrestling match where the one from God, whom Jacob is wrestling, asks Jacob to let him go. Jacob refuses. It would seem that Jacob, not this messenger from God, is the one intent on fighting. Who knows? Maybe the messenger showed up ready to give Jacob that blessing and to pledge solidarity as Jacob went to meet his brother Esau the next day. But Jacob just started fighting for that blessing because that's all he'd ever known. He couldn't imagine a God who might actually be on his side. He assumed God was on the side of the law, the side of his brother, that God was somehow the mastermind behind everything that had ever held him down, that he needed to somehow fight and pull that blessing from God's grip. I wonder how many LGBT plus folks have been misled into thinking that their fight is against God. I wonder how many women have thought it was God who didn't affirm their vocational calling, that sexism or gender roles were somehow God's making. I wonder how many in poverty have bought into that prosperity gospel idea and thought that God must not be blessing them because they haven't been faithful enough. I wonder how many struggling with mental illness or physical illness or loss have thought the same thing, that somehow this is punishment from God, a reflection somehow of their lack of faith. How many people wake up every day ready for a fight, thinking it is God they need to struggle with, wrestle with, not realizing that God is right there at their side, struggling and wrestling with them as they lay claim to that blessing which God always intended for them, right from the start. If you hear nothing else this morning, I want you to hear that the biblical story tells us over and over again of a God who is on the side of those who wrestle, who struggle for justice, for equality, for liberation, for health, wholeness, for hope and peace and transformation. transformation. God is on the side of those who wrestle. So if you are someone who wrestles or has wrestled in your life, who has struggled against one thing or another, don't feel like you need to waste your energy wrestling God too. God's blessing is already yours. God will strive alongside you as you wrestle and as you persist in laying claim to that blessing in a world that may not recognize that it belongs to you. Let me also say this. Sometimes we have such a hard time shaking that idea that God is the enemy, that God's the one who's holding us back from something. So if you do at times find yourself wrestling with God, it's okay. You won't hurt God. You can't hurt God. And in fact, God will hang in there with you and even let you think that you've stolen your blessing from God, if that's what you need. And sometimes, frankly, wrestling with God is what gives us the confidence to go and wrestle our blessing from the world. The hymn we're about to sing is an old Negro spiritual. It's written by Charles Price Jones. He was an African-American religious leader and hymn writer. He understood that God's blessing for and solidarity with those who struggled for justice, for liberation, and for equality. And so this hymn boldly and persistently lays claim to God's blessing. It even audaciously and stubbornly asserts, "I will not be denied, I would not be denied." So let us stand and sing together.